welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this week's edition of the Rec Poker Podcast, Forums Edition. You're stuck with me because our own Bluff Sterini is watching his Steelers maybe lose to the Browns, maybe win, but probably lose. I'm Chris Jones. You can find me 5v5 on PokerStars, the PokerStars home game, as well as on Twitter and Threads. And as always, we are sponsored by the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino. We really thank them for their support. And they've got a tournament series coming up in October. They'll be doing their scary themed one for Hollow Scream. And it's always a good one. It's about a $360 one, multiple day ones. There's some really good value in this tournament. It usually gets a pretty big prize pool, and I think that seeing the crowds we're seeing in live games, I think they'll probably have one of their, they'll definitely get a big crowd for this. So it's worth marketing on your calendar and making your way out there if you have the chance. But I'm just one of the people who make up the Wrecking Crew. I'm also joined by my esteemed colleagues who I'll let them introduce themselves as well.
My name is Joe Coolis, and you can find me on Twitter at Joe Cool PhD, cool with a K, or Elvita11 in the home game.
I'm Kim Kilroy. I am PetVet or PetVet33 on most platforms, Fergie56 in the home game.
And I'm Rob Washam, and I'm Rabman50 just about everywhere.
And tonight, we're going to be talking about a post in the forums by ARW, and who's been a frequent poster, gives some really thorough posts. And this one, I think, is an interesting one. It's one I think that maybe a lot of players who play in like a sort of a smaller field, maybe one of the daily tournaments that they're playing in their local card rooms, they might find where there isn't a huge number of people paid in these sort of tournaments, and we have ourselves in a situation where this is a very common, I think, sort of, if you survive this long, it's a very common point to find yourself at. So there's 25 left and there's 15 paid, and he's playing 8-handed. So we're getting down to it. We got to get 10 more people to go home before we get paid. And that's kind of where these tournaments really, like there's inflection points in these tournaments, but this is one of those key times in these tournaments where we want to try to find our way, obviously, into this final table or into the paid money and then going towards the final table. ARW writes, I built up an early chip lead and stayed a top 10 stack to this point. So we're in good shape to make the money with this stack. We can try to take advantage of this and put some pressure on as the bubble plays into this a bit more. And he writes, my table was playing straightforward with no one playing crazy, no one really getting out of line, but everyone was fighting to get chips when they play a hand. His opponent raises from the hijack to 2.25 big blinds. I don't know how you quite do that. Maybe this is online, actually. I thought this was live, but once he says that, it sounds like it might be online. But anyway, his opponent raises from the hijack to 2.25 big blinds with about 25 blinds behind. He has king, and he's in the cutoff. So right next door, and he's trying to decide between 3-betting or calling. And he has 50 big blinds. So he covers this player, and the players behind him, respectively, on the button, he covers all of them, have 30 big blinds in the button, 15 in the small blind, and 20 in the big blind. So we cover everyone, including the original raiser. We've got a very strong holding. And let's just start there. What are your thoughts here about this kind of situation and deciding between sort of raising or calling with this kind of holding in this kind of spot?
Do you want me to go?
Sure, yeah, let's hear you.
I like raising better, but I know that the solver would say, and I'm just checking it on GTO Wizard now, it's about 50-50 call or raise.
Mm-hmm.
So I like the call is obviously to induce the stacks behind us to shove, and disguise the strength of our hand if we do get a heads up with the pre-flop raiser. I just always prefer raising with these hands. Like I don't want three people calling behind and going there with kings.
I kind of agree there. I probably raise more often than I call. I think if I had fewer chips and I was trying to, build up my stack, but right now I'm ahead of everybody at the table, right? Or everybody that's involved in this hand. So I don't feel the need to try to induce people to play to build a bigger chip stack. So if I was like at 20 big blinds or, something like that, then maybe I would do just a call just to try to get more people involved so I could gather more chips. But when I'm at this chip stack, I agree with Kim. I don't want to go multi-way. I want to go against one person who feels they're strong enough to come after me after I 3-bet.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with everything that's been said, except for I would say it depends on, I mean, if it's an online tournament, what are the stakes? And I guess that's true for live as well, because with King, people will make so many mistakes in terms of what they're calling off with that these stack depth stages don't know how to play them very well. And so you don't really need to do a lot to induce people to get something in if they've got a hand. And you really don't want to, I mean, I don't even know if you want to have two callers if you're going to have people that can outdraw you, on the flop with some, garbage that they decided to call easily. So I do think you need to raise it, but I think that raise may even be just all in if the stakes are low enough, and you'll get enough action on your big hands not to have to worry about it.
Yeah, and I'm gonna throw it out. Like I think I do tend to raise. I think as the bigger stack here, I tend to raise more often here as well. Like what Rob said here, but I will flat, particularly if I've seen somebody behind me, be very active in terms of their shoving and squeezing spots. Then I'm like, okay, I can really kind of make a meal out of this one. So I will sometimes find a flat, and I will if I had 20 big blinds in this spot or 15 big blinds, then I'm really finding a lot of flats, because my risk of sort of ruin here is lower, and I can and the value of getting more involvement in this hand from folks. Whereas when I just shove, I just kind of win a lot. And that just feels like with kings, it just feels really ugly. And then the question, I guess, is, so if we are going to raise here, Joe, you mentioned maybe against sort of less experienced players, maybe we even just kind of put it in and just put some people to the test. But if we're not going to put it in, how big are we going?
I'm going 7.5 to 8 here, but probably closer to 7.5 with this strong a hand.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed. Like 3 times, right around 3 times the original raise. That's going to be putting a lot of pressure on the stacks behind you.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to be able to just call,
mm-hmm.
because they're going to be putting so much of their stack at risk. Their only option then is to go all in, which is what you want, right? You've got kings. You would love one of these smaller stacks to go all in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't even mind keeping it 6.5 to 7.
Right.
Just
yeah, and I would say even here with the lower I'm probably even going a little lower than that. I'm probably going 5.5 to 6 here because I'm in position, because the other stacks are so short, and because I want to give them some room to feel like I could fold. where it might get harder the bigger I go. But I can see the reason to do the bigger raise will actually put some pressure on the stacks, like a 20 and 30 big blind stack behind us can't really think about calling. So it will definitely induce some potential shoves if that's what we're trying to get with some of their stronger holdings. So ARW writes, as played, I decided to call. The 30 big blind stack jammed all in. The original razor folded, and I called with king king, and I lose to jack jack. He's not being results oriented, not wanting to worry about this. This was a great spot for me. But he has some additional questions. When we do this, when we do take the flat option, what is his question is, what is the worst hand that we think that the button would do this with? Like what kinds of hands are we getting to? And I think this is an interesting question because this is start of the question of like, can I flat here? What hands are actually typically doing? I mean, obviously they can have anything, right? Because it can be, it could be total nonsense. But against a competent player, what are you expecting to see once the button takes this action?
Offsuit aces like ace queen would be the worst, maybe. I would say the solver likes pocket eights to pocket tens. I know people will do it with a lot more than that. Sevens, sixes, fives, they'll do it to squeeze, like thinking they've got like a lot of folds there. They're not worried about the collar. Like they're only worried about the initial razor. So, and then the initial razor has to worry about the collar. So I've seen them do it with a lot less than eights, but at the stack size, the solver likes eights to tens, and sometimes jacks, but prefers just to raise with jacks. And then it also likes the suited kings, king, queen, king, jack, king, 10.
Okay. So. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think especially those smaller pairs, I do see that a lot. Even at some of the higher stakes games, I see people doing this with like deuces or threes in squeeze spots, and then getting snapped off by things like kings. I think that is something. I think if you have those kinds of opponents, those are the kinds that you can maybe start to think about flatting here with kings.
Yeah. I don't mind the squeeze with threes and deuces, but I prefer it against one opponent, not when you've had two people.
In
the hand. So
Well, it's really the squeeze is usually typically because there is a raise and a call. And then you're squeezing, they call it a squeeze because there's that guy who called is in between. Right? So we're squeezing him, and we're actually squeezing the original guy because he has to worry about the guy
right
after him. So I think what happens in that squeeze situation is people will expand their range quite a bit because of the dynamic there between the original razor and the caller. There's so much pressure now when you do raise. So I think you do get a little bit wider range. I personally, when I first looked at this question, I thought nines or tens plus, ace king, ace queen, and then maybe king queen suited and hands like that would be my value squeeze. And then I'd probably throw in some smaller like ace four, ace five suited to round it out a little bit.
But you wouldn't shove with aces. You would just raise.
Yeah, I've squeezed. I'm not saying shove.
I'm saying this is a squeeze for all in. So like he's just asking what hands are the worst.
Well, at the stack sizes that you are, if you got 30 big blinds and you're, you might as well at that point just jam it all in with any two cards that you're planning on squeezing with.
But you wouldn't want to do that with aces. No.
Why
I
not?
wouldn't want to do that with aces. I would just raise with aces. And I would raise with
Okay.
some other hands too, right? And some hands that I'm going to fold, like those, like you said, those like lower suited aces. You can just raise with. Now you're going to raise fold those. You're going to raise call your aces, ace king
Well,
suited,
yeah, I
kings,
know it.
queens.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I'm looking at the chip stack sizes. And I'm thinking that I'm going to be putting a lot more pressure on them by jamming all in with 15 big blinds or 20 big blinds.
Yeah,
Right. But this guy has 30.
yeah, I think that's
And I
the
agree
Well,
with 15.
yeah,
I agree
15 or
with
yeah,
20, I think they're all getting in. I don't think there is a
yeah.
raise size, but
right.
30 maybe I think there's room to maybe
Yeah,
have two
okay.
sizes. Yeah.
I'll give you that.
Yeah.
At 30, yeah, you probably do have a raise where you can get away from it and still have 20 big blinds. So,
Right. Um so I mean I think it's interesting to think about, kind of what is the word. I think that's a really interesting way to think about this. Um ARW also asks, how often do you think one of the players behind will take this option, take this squeezing option? And this is where I think, we're starting to think about, well, if I'm gonna do this flatting, it really, because what I don't want to see this go is like four ways to a flop with kings, ace magnets, and now I'm just like don't know what to do with myself. Um, but I do think that um, this question for me depends on the field. It really depends on the field, and it depends on our opponents. Um, we're getting down to it, and there are some tournaments where, as we're getting down to like 10 away from the money, that people aren't gonna like do a bunch of nonsense. Like they're tightening up, they're becoming sort of clamshells. They're not gonna go crazy here. And in fact, we are gonna find ourselves like they're gonna take their ace jack offsuits. And um I think there's some types of opponents who's gonna take their ace jack offsuit and squeeze jam here. And I think there's some who are gonna be like, I'm either folding or flatting here, but I'm never jamming it in here. And I think we have to make some observations about our opponents in terms of like what kinds of players we're up against. If we're taking this flatting action, we should know who behind us has the capability of taking I think what we want to have happen is, because I agree with some of those thoughts about ace queen and maybe eights or nines being sort of like hands that probably do this on a fairly regular basis. But I think it's those hands like, will they do this with fives? Will they do this with ace jack? Will they do this with king queen? Some of those kinds of hands. And if we can say yes to that, then I start to like the flat a lot more. But I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that this is a good advertisement for paying attention, particularly if you get into the tournament, very early. You've got a ton of chips early on. You can use them to, particularly if it's a smaller field, to start getting notes, getting some ideas. This may not be the smartest thing that I do, but everybody on the panel can criticize me if they do that. But sometimes if I get a button opener and I'm on the small blind and I want to find out what the guy to the left of me is going to do, I'll just call, which makes me look a little fishy by calling the small blind. But if I could do that once or twice, and every time he squeezes, well, that's something I'm writing down for later in the tournament in the hopes to say, well, what's he going to do in that situation? And can I get him or her to do that at a later point? It doesn't cost a lot, right? I mean, it is a half a big blind, but it gives me a lot of information. But you also can watch and see who squeezers like to squeeze. And so they're going to more likely do it. So if you see it a couple times, whereas another player just simply flats all the time in that spot, well, that's really good information as well that you really need to mine in a tournament, even if you don't see them again, because you just never know. You never know who's going to be back at the final table if you make it.
If you just look at the
Yeah,
ranges, if you just look at the ranges that are likely to 3-bet all in, that can give you a pretty good idea of how often people are going to be they're going to be doing this, right? So let's say you think it's probably a 10% range that might three bet all in here. Well, that means that 10% of the time, somebody's going to have a hand that they can do that with, and 90% of the time they're going to fold.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's really math at that point in time, other than what Joe said, any observations you have about a specific opponent. Well, with no information whatsoever, all you need to do is determine what you feel their range would be to make that move. And then what is that percentage? And that'll tell you how often it'll happen.
Right. And the nice thing is if you think that they're all playing that way, you get that 10% three times, right? So then it starts to become a more likely scenario versus if there's just one player behind you and if you're flatting here with kings from the small blind and you're counting on the big blind to do this, then you've got, I think, a dicier proposition. In fact, the earlier we are, the more I think we can try to consider these sort of slow play or whatever you want to call these sort of trapping moments, because there's more opportunity for somebody to wake up with the kinds of hands that we're hoping that they have when we've got a hand as strong as kings. So ARW's last question, I think, is the one that I'm sort of curious to hear from everyone, whether you do any randomizing at any point in your sort of poker play. And ARW writes, I wanted to randomize how often I call or three bet. What technique would you use at the table to randomize it? This is why I thought it was live, because I think this is super easy online, right? There are these little randomizer, little clock things that you can just have on as part of most, playing sessions, and you can just get a random number generator, and it's like, it's not really even, that's the best way to do it if you're going to play online, I think. But I'm curious, do any of you randomize in any decisions you make at the poker table? And if you do, how do you do it, particularly live?
I don't.
Well, I don't.
Yeah.
Some people would argue that my play entirely is random.
No, I don't, but if I was to do it, there's something we learned in the Poker Brain when we were doing the book study with Matt Matros. He likes to use cards. He likes to use the suits and the colors.
Mm-hmm.
So you look at your first card. If it's red, it's it's either red or black, and you choose that before the session starts, right? So you know that if a decision is going to be made, you're going to go, if you're going to fold or call, right? Your decision is call. Let's say your decision is call or fold. If the first card you look at is red, you're going to call. If it's black, you fold. That's your, you've got your randomization there. You could also pick a specific suit. And if that first card is that suit, then it's like you got your 25%. So and he only used those kind of methods because for him, it was either a 50-50 where it's half the time or it's most of the time. And so if it's most of the time, that's more of a 75-25. And that was all he did. He never did the 33 or, whatever. It was just, those were the types of things he randomized. And I generally look at the stakes that I'm playing, the people I'm playing against, and I kind of just, where you would normally randomize, I use the field that I'm against and the opponents that I'm against to determine whether I'm going to call or fold or raise or fold or raise or call or whatever it might be.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a good one. The suits is a good one. One I rarely do this, but there's sometimes like I want to try to do it, and I have done this live. Most any poker chip on earth, certainly the ones I played with in any venue I've been at, have a distinctive thing that is on one point of the chip. It's either like there's like a spade or a club or a diamond, or there's like some of them have dice and it's like a 1 or a 2 or a 3, but there's something on a chip that is like at one spot on the chip, and you can sort of spin it, right? And it can point, toward something right, down, or left. And that's enough. That's it. That's the same kind of thing. I do it in quarters. So it's like, okay, if it goes to the bottom, I'm folding. If it goes to the top, I'm calling or whatever. And so that's another way you can do it, with something that's just immediately available to you at the table, and nobody really even knows what you're doing. Everyone plays with chips, and you can just kind of like quickly spin it on the table, and then it barely anyone knows that that's what's going on, even if you're worried that they're. I wouldn't even be worried. I'd be happy to tell somebody, be like, I'm spinning this to decide. Here we go. But
or you could take a coin. Just take a coin out of your pocket and flip it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've seen people do that at the poker table, and it's hilarious.
Yeah.
Mostly cash, but it's hilarious because they're just gambling.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's all they want to do, is they just want to gamble a little bit.
Right.
They're not really.
I've seen some of those big streams where like I saw there was like almost a $400,000 hand where I think it was like Doug Polk and somebody playing, and he did a randomized thing where he had a spade and a heart, and he said, look, I forget what he had. He had like pocket tens, right? It was a bluff catcher. And he said, if I turn over the heart, you can mix them up. If you turn over the heart, I'll call. If you turn over the spade. And then he got his opponent to show him his hand, and he knew that it was a bluff, right? So now he knows that he wants to call, but he considered it binding. And so he turned it over and he folded, so he lost. But it was one of those where, that's I guess another way to do it, but that seems more far-fetched.
Also, I've seen these card protectors that have these little spinners on them, and it usually has little words like fold, call, raise, whatever.
Oh, fun.
And you see people are all in, and you'll see people spin those. I mean, it's just like a little, like a card protector.
Yeah, magic 8 ball, kind of magic 8 ball poker addiction.
Making poker decisions, right?
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Joe. Go ahead.
I just wanted to make a pitch for people who may be listening to podcasts and going randomizing. Oh my God, I got to go in and randomize my hands now and things like that. Understand that you have to be playing a pretty high level of poker to have anybody to be able to have a good enough idea of what you're doing that randomization benefits you by making you hard to read, or even to get to the point of, like, Polk was saying, frequencies, right? I'm going to do this so that I do enough frequencies. I don't think that I've ever come upon a situation at this point in my career, and I've been playing for about 4 years, that I need to randomize because nobody's watching me that closely.
Right.
So
I would never use it live. I've never used it live. I would always use whatever reads I have at the table instead. If it's a decision between fold and call or call and raise, I would use the reads that I have at the table. And if I don't have a read, then I'm probably erring on the side of lower variance and just either folding or calling. And I tried it online when I used to play before Ontario was a ringed fence. I tried having a randomizer on my desktop. But I just it would take so long to especially if I had more than one table going and go over and try and randomize, and okay, it's 35. Was that lower or higher?
So they changed the ones I've seen. They change so quickly. You're like, okay, I'm making a decision, and then it's already changed. It's hard to know, but okay. Well, yeah. So I agree with you, Joe. I mean, this is not a high priority thing for most players. It's not something that you probably really are ever going to come into a point of needing to do. It is, something that if you are trying to figure out a way to not always do one kind of action. So if you find that you're just, every time I have a draw, right? Every time I have a flush draw, I'm raising too much or something. There may be ways you can try to like sort of slow yourself down a little through this process, and that I think can maybe be a healthy practice, because sometimes we find ourselves, it's not that our opponents are going to read too much into us, but it might be that we're just getting ourselves into too much trouble by not sort of saying, and now we can say maybe we have that sort of card randomization. Well, every time I have a flush draw, I'm going to raise, except when I have clubs. Then I'm going to do, whatever. You can make up your own rules, but or whatever. But that can be a way in which some of that randomization can help in terms of our frequencies that don't have a lot to do with what our opponent's reading, but more like keeping our game in check a little as well.
It's interesting that you brought up that example, Jim. I was going to say Jim. So I'm looking at your name here.
Yeah.
Because that was one of the things that Matt Matros was talking about in that book, Poker Brain. He was talking about if you always raise with your flush draw or always bet with your flush draw, then when the flush comes in, your opponent can very easily fold. But if you never raise or call with your flush draw, when the flush comes in, they won't know whether you have it or not. So that is one area, because people concentrate so much on flush draws at the table. Everybody is concentrating on those. So that's one area where you should try to randomize and not always do the same thing with your flush draw.
Right.
So because we're supposed to argue on this podcast, obviously Miller would make the argument that if you know that your opponents are making errors more frequently in a particular direction, there's no benefit to playing. You really want to just go in one direction, that you just always want to exploit in that direction. And you do that 100% of the time if there's any difference, right? And randomizing is trying to eliminate that difference. So if you know that to a flush draw, people are more likely going to be folding, well, then you just always want to raise your flush. You don't want to actually try to randomize, because you're losing value that way because the frequencies get thrown off. Again, the reason to randomize is to get to the 70-30 that the solver says. But again, we're not playing solver games. We're not playing solvers. We're playing people who make a ton of mistakes, right?
Well, and I think part of that has to do with what Rob was talking about on Matt Matros's sort of explanation there, is that if we, for instance, say my opponents fold too much, I'm going to raise all of my flush draws, right? No matter what. If there's two cards on the flop and I've got two of them in my hand, that's a raising hand. And here we go. The problem lands because it's not just randomizing that moment, but we have to sort of account for all the possible turn and river nodes or cards to come, right? And so on the river, I don't think this matters as much, right? I don't think we need to like randomize our approach or have different frequencies. But if our opponents can say no now, that every time they raise and the third club comes on the turn or doesn't come on the turn, now I can perform this kind of action. And there are going to be some, it's going to take time, and it's going to take certain instances, and it's going to take, and in a lot of cases, if you just show up at like a World Series of Poker event and you're plopped in and you're playing in a player pool that's never seen you before and whatever, yeah, just play your poker, just play your whatever poker you think is best. But over time, if you're playing some good opponents, and even not like, I'm not talking like, elite opponents, but just good observant opponents, there's going to be some areas that they're going to catch up on if you're always playing those kinds of spots the same. That would be my response to that.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's a good note to maybe sort of wrap this up on. Any other thoughts on this post from ARW? No? All right. Well, I want to thank ARW for tuning in and leading us through this conversation. It was a good conversation, lots of good questions asked. As always, I want to thank Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino. And I want to thank Joe, Rob, Kim, for helping out with this conversation. And then you, the listener. We couldn't do this without you. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you again next time.